Elizabeth Holmes actually had an active social life in college, and as much as 2 years after her fraud was exposed, she was reportedly visiting investors pitching new ideas for a new company. Welcome to Scandalcast. In this video, I'm going to discuss ways in which the portrayal of Elizabeth Holmes in the Hulu series The Dropout was very different from the impression I had personally received from other sources, such as books, podcasts, and magazine feature stories about the Theranos scandal. I will focus on two main issues: how Elizabeth was portrayed as poorly socialized at the beginning of the show, and how Elizabeth was portrayed as practically assuming a new, completely different identity as young, carefree Lizzie at the end of the show, after her fraud was exposed. First was the show's portrayal of Elizabeth Holmes as seeming almost poorly socialized, not really interacting well with other young people, and needing to be persistently encouraged to hang out with people her own age and do normal teenage girl things. In one scene, Elizabeth tells Sunny that she doesn't feel things the way other people feel things. Holmes's social interactions are often portrayed so awkwardly on the show that I've seen so many people on social media or in blog articles suggesting or asking if she was somewhere on the autism spectrum. But Elizabeth did not come across as poorly socialized in the book Bad Blood by Wall Street Journal reporter John Carreyrou, the definitive book on the Theranos scandal. It is true that Elizabeth Holmes seemed always eager to rush ahead. She signed up for a college language program while she was still in high school, and she lobbied her professor to let her into a lab meant for graduate students while she was still a freshman. It's also true that on her trip to China, Elizabeth was reportedly bullied by the other students, which is how she ended up hanging out with Sunny most of the time. Elizabeth was reportedly famous in the Chinese language program for being a high schooler who had talked her way into a college program, so it was understandable why the show portrayed her as perhaps turning off the other kids by being overeager and overachieving. But I never got the impression from the book or other sources that Elizabeth was poorly socialized in college. According to the book Bad Blood, outside the lab, Elizabeth led an active social life. Elizabeth pledged a sorority, Kappa Alpha Theta, a sorority whose famous pledges include Jenna and Laura Bush, Sheryl Crow, Melinda Gates, and Cindy McCain, among others. One of her sorority sisters eventually came to work with her at Theranos, though she soon left and said Elizabeth had changed, and at least one of her sorority sisters came to support her during her criminal trial. The show did accurately show her living in a sorority house, yet nevertheless made it seem that she hardly hung out with kids her own age. On the show, Elizabeth is also portrayed as having disconnected, uninterested sex with some frat bro-y seeming college guy who she doesn't seem to have much of a relationship with. But in the book, Elizabeth was described as having a boyfriend, a sophomore named J.T. Batson, who was from a small town in Georgia. The second issue is how the show portrayed Elizabeth's bizarre behavior in the final days of Theranos as a form of suppression of her wrongdoings and an adoption of an almost new, completely different identity, Lizzie, someone who is dating a younger man, a big change from the much older Sunny, someone who wears athleisure instead of black turtlenecks, and who lives a fun, carefree life with her dog, behaving as though nothing has happened and frustrating her former employees. The last scene of the series shows Elizabeth releasing a primal scream as though for a second she is releasing all the emotions she's suppressing before she quickly gathers herself again. In episode 1, Elizabeth's mother advises her to suppress her feelings about her sexual assault.
Men will take and take from you. So you have to decide right now, if you are going to let that stop you.
But how?
You just put it away and forget it. And then one day you'll just be fine again.
In the final episode, Elizabeth recalls this advice as she seemingly chooses to suppress acknowledgement of her wrongdoings at Theranos.
You told me that when you visited me at school, after everything that happened, you told me to just put it away and forget it. If you choose to forget certain things, do you think that's lying?
She then literally casts off her identity as Elizabeth the CEO, removing her black turtleneck and wiping off her lipstick. I assumed that the scene in which Elizabeth's mother advised her to suppress her emotions about her sexual assault was imagined by the showrunners because we couldn't possibly know what she and her mother said to each other about this if it wasn't publicly shared. But the real Elizabeth Holmes herself did recast her story with sexual abuse as a driving force behind why she dropped out of school and as a major factor in her relationship with Sunny Balwani and his influence on her behavior. So it didn't seem strange for the showrunners to make the impact of sexual abuse such a key factor in this show. It is true that in real life, employees expressed frustration and incredulity at Elizabeth's behavior after the scandal broke. Former employees told the Dropout podcast and Vanity Fair magazine how they were struggling to find new jobs with Theranos on their resume, yet Elizabeth expressed a constant chirpy attitude and cheerily introduced her new boyfriend. It is also true that Elizabeth seemed to be in denial about her own wrongdoings. Former Theranos employees told John Carreyrou that she continued to feel that she had been unknowingly wronged by those around her and viewed herself as some sort of martyr. However, from sources I read before the show, it did not feel at all like Elizabeth had cast off her old identity and assumed a new one. In fact, her behavior until the end seemed consistent with who she had always been. The impression I got from everything I read before the show was that the driving theme throughout Elizabeth's life was her obsession with Silicon Valley founders like Steve Jobs and her desire to live and lead according to their examples and teachings. It explained her drive to start a company, to embrace fake it till you make it, and it even explained her behavior at the end, the chirpy positive attitude, the dog, and even the boyfriend. Those were all still consistent with Elizabeth, the wannabe world-changing Silicon Valley founder. I didn't put much stock into Elizabeth's dramatic change of appearance. I figured she couldn't continue dressing in black turtlenecks because it had become a joke. Mere weeks after the Theranos scandal was exposed on October 15, 2015, people were dressing up as Elizabeth Holmes for Halloween. But her actual behavior still seemed to match the old Elizabeth. For example, consider the dog. Elizabeth named the dog Balto after a famous sled dog who, in 1925, had led a team of huskies on a 600-mile trek in Alaska to bring medicine for a diphtheria outbreak. The dog was supposed to represent Theranos' perseverance. Elizabeth told Theranos employees the inspiring story of Balto the Alaskan Husky and allowed this new Balto to roam free around the office. Recall how Elizabeth loved plastering motivational quotes all over Theranos office walls. The dog was a living, breathing representation of one of her positive thinking, motivational business gimmicks. Former employees claimed that while the company was crumbling around her, Elizabeth saw the situation as the beginning of some sort of redemption arc. According to a 2018 Vanity Fair article, Elizabeth had held meetings with filmmakers about collaborating on a documentary about her real story, and she also wanted to write a book. A young entrepreneur who met Elizabeth for coffee in 2018, shortly after the release of John Carreyrou's book Bad Blood, and just a week before Elizabeth finally resigned as CEO of Theranos, wrote about his encounter with Elizabeth in a Medium post. Even then, almost 3 years after her scam was revealed, and mere weeks after a best-selling book detailed her scam to the world, Elizabeth told the young entrepreneur that she had made mistakes, but she insisted that she hadn't defrauded anyone and hadn't put people's lives at risk, and that she planned to rehabilitate both the company's reputation and her own reputation, and that she wouldn't rebrand because the name Theranos had brand recognition. She may have looked completely different, wearing jeans and a blazer rather than her usual black turtleneck, but Elizabeth Holmes hadn't left behind her Theranos CEO identity at all. Like her employees told Vanity Fair, she was still literally plotting a redemption arc in her head. Also in 2018, more than 2 years after the article was released, Holmes was still hitting up Silicon Valley venture capitalists. The aforementioned young entrepreneur who had had coffee with her had met her a few weeks prior at the offices of her first $1 million investor, Tim Draper. The entrepreneur said she was still trying to raise money to save Theranos from bankruptcy. Interestingly, in that 2018 meeting with Draper, Elizabeth was still wearing her typical black outfit with the black turtleneck. So in private, she hadn't dumped the outfit at all. In 2018, John Carreyrou told Vanity Fair that Elizabeth was actually pitching a new startup idea to investors around Silicon Valley. This was after she had already been charged with massive fraud by the SEC. She clearly still believed that some investors were gullible enough to still give her money. Everything I read at the time indicated that Elizabeth still had the same steely determination to succeed as a Silicon Valley CEO, in spite of everything imploding around her. Even her new boyfriend sounded like someone who would fit right into the old Elizabeth's life. The show presented Billy Evans as almost ethereal between billowing white bedsheets, whispering romantic nothings to Elizabeth, and highlighted his age, almost a decade younger than Elizabeth, in stark contrast to Sunny, who had been almost 2 decades older than her. On Instagram, Billy certainly wrote romantic captions under all their photos. But a broader description of Billy Evans makes him seem very similar to Elizabeth and even to Sunny in some ways. Evans had a Silicon Valley background. He had worked at Luminar Technologies, a firm that produced LiDAR for self-driving vehicles. In an episode of the Dropout podcast, a former colleague described Billy Evans as confident, arrogant, and entitled, as somebody who lived a flashy lifestyle and was really into cars. The colleague recalls him boasting about a Lambo he had driven one weekend. The colleague also claimed that Evans was the type of person who refused to take no for an answer. On one occasion, when Evans was informed that he would have to cancel a planned demo because the technology for one of their cars wasn't working properly, Evans railed at his colleagues to just make it work somehow, although they kept telling him it wasn't possible. This trait clearly is reminiscent of Elizabeth. Evans went ahead and gave the demo anyway, and it reportedly didn't go well. Billy Evans seemed to me like the kind of person Elizabeth would date, not necessarily Lizzie. In summary, even Elizabeth's behavior after the scandal was consistent with somebody who had embraced Silicon Valley philosophies of how to respond to adversity. Never give up, plan a triumphant comeback, etc., etc. The dog, the boyfriend, the chirpy positive behavior all matched the same old Elizabeth. This brings me to the end of the video. If you enjoyed this video, please support the channel by liking and subscribing, and thank you for watching.